prosecution has confirmed the man believed to be one of South Africa's worst serial rapists has killed himself. Sifiso Makhubo has been accused of raping 33 children and 2 women. His trial was supposed to have begun today. Stationed outside that court this morning was our reporter Karyn Maughan, who's now back with us. Karyn, I watched one of your earlier crossings to the channel this morning when it seemed every last detail had been put in place for the wheels of justice to begin turning in this case. A really shocking outcome for all involved.
Well, it was quite bizarre because we know that the state was phoning a number of the alleged victims of this man and informing them that he'd actually killed himself. And overwhelmingly, that we got this from the prosecution and from the police who'd been speaking to these children, they had this overwhelming sense of relief and happiness that this man, who they believed had destroyed their lives, in many cases infecting them with the HIV virus, was now gone and couldn't hurt them anymore. And the real level of devastation, I think, came from the prosecuting authority itself, because this was a precedent-setting case. It could have set precedents in terms about how the state dealt with HIV-positive rapists who knowingly went ahead and had sex or raped innocent victims. It could have set huge international benchmarks for legal practice on how those kind of cases were handled. We know that the state spent at least a year looking at legal precedents, looking at arguments, tracking down, and this is a very interesting point, and we can reveal this now because, of course, this man has now passed away, tracking down all elements of this man's history. He was in prison before on a rape conviction. He did receive jail counseling for the HIV virus. He did acknowledge that he had the virus and that he was coming to terms with it. And the state would have used that evidence to say, you knew that you had HIV, you went ahead, you raped these children, and you could have foreseen that you could literally give them a death sentence by your conduct.
What do we know about the circumstances of his suicide?
Well, what we heard in court today was that he apparently took his prison blanket. We don't know how he tore it up. The prosecutor in court described it today as torn into strips. He turned it into a rope and he hanged himself. Interestingly enough, he did have a bucket inside the cell, and his own lawyer saying that needs to be investigated, because he basically propped himself under the bucket, kicked the bucket from underneath himself, and then obviously hanged himself. When the investigating officers went this afternoon, just before court resumed at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was still hanging there. The medical officials had described it as a suicide. Those pictures of his body were handed in as evidence, and the judge and the court were prepared to accept that it was a suicide.
Karyn, what I thought was rather heartbreaking was that for the children, I mean, despite their relief that you've spoken of, they've spent almost a year being prepped by National Prosecuting Authority officials to go and face their alleged attacker in an open court.
There was one of the most profound moments was when I was talking to the prosecutor before this incident happened, and I'd said to her, you know, these kids, obviously massive trauma, they were held at knife point, they were held at gunpoint, they were threatened with death, they were made to undress in school toilets, in stadiums, in cold, dark, horrendous places for hours, threatened. This man had stalked them, he'd found out who their friends were, he'd positioned himself so that they would trust him, and this massive trauma. And in some instances, he allegedly robbed them as well, these very impoverished little children. And I said to the prosecutor, but of course you're going to have them testifying from a separate room through cameras. And she said, no, they're coming into the courtroom and they're ready to face him. And that was the most profound thing for me, because it's taken a year of therapy to get these kids to a point where they could conceivably, and one of them would have today, walked into a courtroom and looked into this man's eyes and testified about what they say he did to them. And I think there is something, obviously there is this huge sense of relief that he's gone, that he's out of their lives. But I think there is, there's a deeper subtext here that these children aren't really now in a position to tell their stories and to tell how this human being intervened in their lives and fundamentally changed it. And I think there is a sort of echo of sadness and tragedy in that.
Karyn, he would naturally have gone through assessments with psychologists and the like before. What was their assessment of his psychological situation?
The state, interestingly enough, preempted some kind of psychological defense from him because of the sheer volume of kids that he'd raped, allegedly. And they sent him to the Westkopje Psychiatric Hospital. And the psychiatrists there found unequivocally that he knew the difference between right and wrong. But in sort of layman's terms, he was a complete psychopath. So, you know, that he could see that these children were suffering. He could see that they were in a lot of, pain or deep distress. He could reasonably have foreseen that, the consequences of having HIV and having sex with a child, potentially passing on the virus, but just would not care. And I mean, that's a very damning and indicative finding to make against someone, and it is typical of the pathology of a serial rapist.
Do we know what brought him to that point where he committed these crimes?
We don't know. We know he was in jail for quite a few years. I think he served 4 years of a sentence that he was sentenced to in 2001 for rape. And then he was released early. And he did go through a number of counseling sessions throughout that prison experience, particularly with regard to his HIV. There was a feeling from the state that maybe raping these children who were clearly virgins may be part of a campaign in order to get better. We didn't have any of that evidence. His lawyer, of course, saying that he believed that they'd got the wrong person and that he would be exonerated. But the fact of the matter is, Joanne, is that my understanding is that in every single one of these cases, he'd left semen on the bodies of these children. So his DNA was connected to every single one of these children. The state elected to withdraw charges in one instance where they found that the DNA did not match, but they had very concrete, very powerful evidence in that regard. Why he did it remains to be seen, but he was certainly very cold-blooded, according to the evidence in the indictment. Like I said, stalking these children, knowing who they were, either forcing them or putting them in situations where he said, I know your neighbor Sibongile, you must come with me, and these trusting little mites going along to this horrendous experience. And I think the damage that he's done cannot possibly be underestimated. If indeed those charges would have been proved, which I think given the level of evidence that the state had, they definitely would have been.
Karyn Maughan, it's a very tragic story for the survivors of that indeed. Thank you very much for your insight into that.
News that moves. eNCA.com.